Hey everyone, welcome to the conclusion of the Megazone 23 retrospective on obscure anime memories. That's right, after a little over 2 years I've finally come back to this quadrilogy in order to watch the final two movies and give them their own fair evaluation. Now, there is a reason for this, mostly because I don't organize things on my channel. I didn't really watch these two movies as the first two Megazone 23s felt iconic enough on their own that I wanted some time between watching those and watching the final two movies of the franchise. However, with a new batch of one-offs on the way, here we are talking about Megazone 23 Part 3 and Part 4. Are they as good or as memorable as Parts 1 or 2? Are they necessary sequels? Is this video a necessary sequel? Well, the answer to most of the questions that I've just asked is kind of. Not really, no. But does that mean they're a waste of your time? Well, of course not. Again, that's subjective, but as I hope to point out, there are many pros and cons to Part 3 and 4, with the noted caveat that they, of course, are nowhere near as iconic, memorable, or influential as Parts 1 or 2. Now, that being said, I think it's important that we give a little context due to the fact that Megazone 23 is more than just these two movies, and because I haven't talked on it in a long time. If you don't know what Megazone 23 is, it's a series of movies that follow Shogu Yahagi and his quest to save humanity on the artificial city Megazone 23. Or at least that's parts 1 and 2. Part 3 and 4 are set 1,000 years after the conclusion of Part 2, when the city has crashed back down on the Earth and people have started to recolonize the world, and deals with the consequences of technological overdependence. In line with Megazone 23 tradition, Parts 3 and 4, which are collectively known as Part 3 because they are one combined story, is directed by another new director. Part 1 was Toru Miyaura, Part 2 was Ichiro Itano, and Parts 3 and 4 are directed by Shinji Aramaki, although Kenichi Yatagai is also credited as a director, so I don't know if they're co-directors or one is the assistant director. I'm just going off the Wikipedia information. My point is that we should not expect Parts 3 or 4 to run exactly like Parts 1 or 2, because not only does it have its own new setting, but it is also directed by a different guy, and is even made by a different studio. In this case, it's produced by AIC and Artmic, as opposed to Artland and Artmic. So there is some continuity differences here, even if it is within the same franchise. With that in mind, let's get to a brief plot summary so that we can then get to the meat and potatoes of this video. Part 3, like Parts 1 and 2, is constructed around the idea of a naive protagonist learning the true reality of the world he lives in, a few unsettling truths, and then doing his best to counteract these in order to save humanity. Now, this is set 1,000 years after the first two movies, and in this new setting, humanity now lives in Eden, a computer-controlled city that harbors them until it deems that the Earth is ready for human habitation again. Now, it's not said specifically, or at least not specifically in the translation of the movie that I saw, but I believe Eden is just a big chunk of Megazone 23 that crashed down on the Earth. And this isn't said, but it seems to be that way, because I don't know how else they could have constructed all of this, and they do reference the events of the first two movies rather frequently, so we do know that there is historical precedent here, and people are at least somewhat knowledgeable of it. Over the 1,000 years of living in this city, the system, that is the computer that controls the city, has observed the flaws of humanity and ultimately deemed them unworthy to spread across the Earth again. Eventually, this gap in logic leads the computerized system to the conclusion that destroying humanity would actually be beneficial, and it should do this by relaunching the city into space so that the computer defense system known as Atom, which is located on the moon and a plot point in the previous two movies, can just blow up humanity. Now, none of this is said until about the last 10 minutes of the movie, but I do think it's important to note just so we understand everything that goes on. Enter EJ Takanaka, a former hacker now working for the governing body of E equals X, referred to as EX throughout the movie. I'm going to say EX. They never say E equals X. That's how it's subtitled. I'm just going to say EX because that's what they say. After joining EX, EJ Takanaka realizes that something isn't quite right. While this group does seem like a noble one intent on stopping hackers, or netjackers as they're called, and simply maintaining order, his bouts with some of these neckjackers, and especially the hacktivist group Orange, leads him to realize that not everything is as it seems. This is confirmed when the Orange leader, Scion, baits Yuji into running into the OG Eve, who has been sleeping away for the past 1,000 years, and I guess she's been in this little sleep chamber since Shogu hung out with her in the first 2 movies. Although if I recall my lore correctly, this is accurate, and I do support the continuity here. Yuji wakes up Eve at the end of the first movie, yes, this took 40 minutes, so we basically skipped everything else, and learns that the system isn't acting quite normally and is actually holding humanity back. In addition to this, Yuji learns that EX is actually solely concerned about maintaining the system, as opposed to actually bettering it or helping humanity through the system, and that they're even considering some dangerous plans detrimental to humanity, most notably the Heaven Project, which is the computer's idea of launching the city back into space to eliminate humanity. What this means is that EX, the governing body, is actually corrupt and must be stopped, and that the hacktivists who have been fighting Yuji, or that he's been kind of grappling with for the first 30-40 minutes of this movie, are actually the good guys, trying to stop Project Heaven and the launch into space. As such, Yuji switches sides and teams up with Scion and Eve to destroy the system and prevent Project Heaven's execution. Now, they do this after kind of intervening in the conflict that Orange has initiated against EX. Do note they kind of make their own third team as Orange abandons them and Scion to their own devices, and eventually manage to get to the system's core, where, at the cost of Eve's life, they do stop Project Heaven by literally blowing up the computer core and having a talk with Dai Wan. Now, Don Wan is the leader of EX. He's referred to as Bishop, and he's this weird spiritual leader who is quoted as being the one who carries out and announces the will of the system. He's seen as a religious leader, and he's held up very highly by people like director Jacob, the guy who actually runs the day-to-day operations of EX. More on these guys later, but what we need to know is that Daiwan may or may not actually be a Shogu Yahagi from the first movie. It's not really clear in the version I watched, who was possessed by the system and as such was kind of brainwashed into executing Project Heaven. When Yuji makes it to the core of the system, he frees Daiwan from the computerized menace that was controlling everything around them. Jump to the final scene where we get a happy ending of Yuji reuniting with his girlfriend, who does shockingly little in this series of movies, and cut the credits. Now, while it was a rather truncated plot summary, for reasons we're going to get into later, you will understand why that is the way it is, in addition to the fact that I don't want my videos to simply be plot summaries. Megazone 23 Parts 3 and 4, which are essentially one movie, is the Phantom Menace of Megazone 23. That is to say, it's not nearly as good as what came before it. There are good and bad to this piece, and to further explain that, I think it's most convenient if we just break those sides down and let you decide if you think that this movie is worth your time. Now, starting with the cons, because I do like to end videos on a positive note, Megazone 23 Part 3 and 4 are some of the most C-grade things I've ever watched. That is to say that they're not great, but they're not awful. But that in and of itself could be considered a flaw, as there's nothing really bad or weird enough to be super interesting or memorable. Everything here feels pretty okay. And for a series coming off 2 of the most memorable things of all time, these feel extremely flat and borderline boring at times. I mean, nothing here feels too interesting or new, and there isn't anything that's super emotionally involving or taxing. It's just a kind of, I hate to say it, but at least from a writing perspective, bland story. It feels like not a lot happens here, even though a lot obviously does. It's something which didn't really grab my attention 20 minutes into it, which is not something that I can say for the other Megazone 23s, and it's something which I didn't actually expect from this. I was expecting something weird or bad. I know the reviews for this aren't as glowing as the original 2, but I wasn't expecting just meh. On both a writing and technical level, Megazone 23 Part 3 and 4 are by no means a home run. In fact, they're markedly inferior to their predecessors, and it's obvious by just looking at the movie. While the first 2 were famous for having different animators and animation styles due to budget concerns and creative team fluctuations, the animation here is not as memorable as either. Part 1 has this poppy, kind of smoother look, and Part 2 has a more detailed focused, stereotypical 80s anime look, and they're both executed very well. However, with part 3, we got kind of an in-between. It's not as realistic as part 2, but it's not as poppy as part 1. And it's not as consistent as either. I'm just going to say it. I think they were kind of running out of money here because there are animation inconsistencies. There are animation issues throughout the movie. You'll get a nice flowing action scene followed by a shot like this where it literally skips frames. And I don't know if that's because the VHS rip that I saw online was bad and they uploaded a bad copy, or if that's actually what happens. Since there is no other tracking issues that I can see during these shots, I'm going to assume that's the actual content of the video and not just a VHS issue though. Especially since it happens at multiple times randomly. Although it does seem to happen mostly in vehicular scenes, where I guess it was hoped that we would just not notice it, or that the movement would be sweeping enough for us to kind of overlook this kind of things. It's hard to, though, when you're looking at something skip frames. While I did think that the art was pretty okay for my first viewing, upon reviewing B-roll for the making of this video, I did realize that there are a lot more skipped frames than I thought. And there are a lot of things that are just not outlined the way they should be, and it's obvious that they did not have time or resources enough to consistently put a good amount of effort or attention into every single frame that was animated. Some of them are really nice and really clean, especially a lot of the video game shots. Oh yeah, a lot of the cool sci-fi stuff is just them in a VR video game, so kind of an advertisement fake out, not gonna lie, but aside from that, those scenes do look nice, but not every scene is held up to that standard. And it's especially prominent in scenes featuring characters or dialogue, scenes which by the nature of them are already going to be less visually stimulating, and I guess the producers decided, well, it's going to be boring anyways, so we don't need to put all the effort into those scenes. There are a lot of scenes where it seems that it was just kind of rushed, and I don't want to chalk that up to incompetence or malpractice, but more to the idea that this was a later installment in the franchise and probably wasn't as well crafted and probably didn't get all the attention that the other two got. However, this lack of production finesse does not excuse a lack of character finesse. While you can say that the technicals of a piece are dependent on factors outside of individual skill, i.e. it's obvious that budgetary issues might have constrained all of the animation here to some extent, that doesn't necessarily impede character or writing beats. Some people can tell you that 12 Ounce Mouse is still a great show even though it is animated the way it is because of its interesting plot or character beats. Now I use that as a very extreme example, but my point is that no matter how great something looks, it can still be boring if there is no emotional attachment to it, and a lot of this emotional attachment, at least for the viewer, comes in either the form of a plot that is riveting and interesting, or in character beats and developments that are riveting and interesting. However, neither of those two elements are riveting or interesting enough to really prop up the technicals a lot of the time. The plot, while relatively concise and consistent and logical, is also relatively bog standard. Oh, we learn that the bad guys are actually the good guys, and now we gotta stop the evil corporation. And they do. But aside from the fact that we recontextualize who the antagonists are, which is hinted at throughout the first movie anyways, we don't really get too much of an interesting plot, as it just boils down to we gotta save the crazy guy from doing the big crazy thing. This could be excused though if characters were developed or likable enough to really carry us through. But they're really not. As will be evidenced by the sparse character segment of this retrospective that I tacked on for the sake of tradition or format, I guess, there is not a single character in here that I found super compelling or relatable or interesting. They do have the most minuscule examples of personality quirks that we could identify, but nowhere near what I would consider actual character arcs or interesting character beats or really developments. We have the main protagonist of Yuji, who is extremely generic and doesn't really have an arc. He's a steadfast man who ends the story as a steadfast young man with a girlfriend that I should note doesn't really do anything in this movie and doesn't really have that many plot beats of her own. In fact, she does a surprisingly little amount in this film. We have Yuji's boss, Jacob, who is textbook insane business sociopath guy. We have the possessed Don Juan, his boss, who is literally only gets about 22 seconds of non-possessed dialogue. We have the secretary lady who gets shot. And we have all of Yuji's friends that I guess they're supposed to look quirky, and to be fair, they did a good job in the visual design department with these guys, but don't really necessarily get character beats of themselves. It's weird. When I watched these two movies, they felt bizarrely empty to me, and I didn't realize why until talking about the character beats here. There are basically none. So what we're left with is a plot story whose plot is so simple and not necessarily paced excellently enough to grab our full attention. Since there are no major character beats here, it feels a lot emptier than you would expect an hour-and-a-half piece to. And we don't really have anything to really focus on anyways, and I do remember thinking multiple times throughout my viewing of this, what is going to happen next? Not because I was so engaged by the plot that I needed to know what happened, but simply because it felt like the scene was over 5 seconds in a lot of the time, and I wanted to just get to the next scene. No character beats means no emotional investment, means that a plotting plot feels even more plotting. Now, this could be compensated to some extent if the visuals were extremely amazing in some way. Sometimes shaking keys in front of a cat is enough. However, since the visuals here are, as mentioned, very inconsistent and not always the best, they of course are nowhere near enough to fully grab the audience's attention when we really peel back the surface layer of things and realize that there's basically no character beats here and a relatively plotting plot present. The complete failure to execute on characters is the Achilles heel, and whether or not you find yourself a character-based person, you still need a story with at least one or two characters. And since we basically don't have those here, we don't have much of a story, and so we don't really have much of a movie at the end of the day. In addition, the OST is not as good as the original, and it's not as memorable either. Although I will say that I think that the music placement is slightly better than that in Part 1. I remember commenting in Part 1 that sometimes they play the wrong songs for the wrong scenes. Another issue with Part 3 and 4 that I think I should comment on is the story has a surprising amount of logistical and logical holes. I get it that this is a 80s cyberpunk themed thing, so we gotta have a lot of tech talk, we gotta have a lot of computers, we gotta have cyber stuff and hacking. I understand that. However, there is this weird problem the movie has where we'll talk about hacking in the system and harvesting data and all this computer talk, and then instead of a guy sitting at a computer typing, which would be a logical, if perhaps a little boring thing to see in that conversation, we then cut to riding on motorcycle or giant robot fight, which kind of clashes the whole data side against the whole physical force side here. There is this conflict of, are we going to make a piece focused on the hacking side of things, or are we going to make a thing focused on the mech warrior action side of things? And they don't really connect these two things that well, so it feels kind of silly when we talk about all these delicate hacking operations, when in reality we're just talking about a big giant unga bunga robot blowing up a computer drive. Like, that's not hacking, guys, that's just an explosion. There's this weird disconnect where it feels like they had trouble reconciling these two things. Like, they wanted to make hacking really cool, but they also want a giant robot action, and instead of making a more organic way to connect these two, they just mashed them together. In addition, all this talk of data and the system and algorithms made a lot of the dialogue in this piece feel like some kind of weird corporate marketing seminar. Every time I heard someone say the system, or every time I heard someone talk about life data or human data, I just kept hearing all those ads you see on YouTube about how to make your marketing more appealing to more people, or how to maximize HR schedules and payroll with insert AI product here. It's not very entertaining dialogue a lot of the time, as the oversaturation of tech terms makes it feel a little weird. Like, it's not technobabble per se, but it feels like technobabble terms leak into normal conversations and make them feel weird and less applicable to us. That's not to say the movie is underwhelming as a whole and that it doesn't have redeemable qualities. Megazone 23, 3, and 4 do have some memorable things and do have merit to them, at least to some extent. And not all of this merit is tied to their heritage, although there is some that I would like to go over quickly. There are callbacks in these two films to the other two films, which do feel relatively organic and in place, and that I genuinely respect. For one, bringing back the character of Eve is kind of brilliant, as this is the only character who logically could possibly be in both the original movies and these two movies. As an AI, it makes sense that in a well-maintained computer system, she can live for up to 1,000 years. And I do like that fact that this is kind of a little bit of connective tissue between the two. And since she knows Shogu from the first two movies, we get some name drops here and there that further flesh out the universe here and add some historical continuity. There's also character consistency with the character of Eve, as even though it's been 1,000 years, she still puts humanity first and is still extremely concerned about their well-being. For that, I do give kudos to finding a unique way to link settings 1,000 years apart together in a way that makes sense. Unlike Shogu's possible appearance here, although we'll get to that in the character section. I also respect the idea to set this story 1,000 years after the previous ones, as having a new story in the same universe naturally feels more fresh and naturally feels like it has more creative possibilities than simply milking the same setting with the same cast over and over again. And there's enough continuity to make it feel relatively natural to me. I have seen this film being criticized for this, and I don't honestly understand it, as I would never criticize DS9 for not mentioning Captain Kirk often enough. I think it was a smart decision to do this, although it does again raise the question of why make this movie in the first place. However, while making said movie, there are still some production values. I know I commented on animation inconsistencies. That's not to say that they're bad, as there are some genuinely gorgeous shots here, and there is some good movement. I don't think this is going to top Megazone 23 Part 2 ever, but there's definitely enough eye candy and enough motion to keep you watching for at least some scenes. There is enough movement to justify the action in this piece being called well executed. Except for the scenes missing frames, but we've gone over that. This film also kind of recycles the idea of everything you know is wrong that we see in the first two films. Although, I'm going to note this as more of a neutral point, as while it is still an interesting idea, it is an idea taken from the first two movies, and it's an idea that's not executed as well or as dramatically as the first two. Although it is not poorly done, I'll say that, so I guess it's still a pro here. And finally, what I think the biggest pro of these two movies is actually its theming. Ironically, my favorite part of 3 and 4, and something that I thought was actually impactful and relatively meaningful, as well as somewhat competently done, was its theme of technological overdependence. And it's very prominent both intentionally and unintentionally throughout the movie. This is a city where everything is computerized and floppy disks hold the key to your future. And it's also a city that is deeply sick on some levels. And I don't mean that in a morality sense. I mean that in a sense is that stuff is literally starting to break down because of this technological overdependence. The system is overworked, and as such it's grown to loathe humanity. And a lot of humanity, at least some people here, struggle to overcome their dependence on the system and really move past it. I think there is a lot of good commentary here about how technological overdependence can both weaken people and limit their growth in both a mental and emotional sense. In this series, it even has a literal impact, as since the system deems people unworthy of leaving the city, no one's left it for like 1,000 years, and as such, most of the Earth is still uninhabited. It is a great theme that is in line with the original two pieces, and does feel relatively nuanced. I think some of this is intentional, as they do a good job of explaining these things, and I think some of it is unintentional, as the sheer amount of technobabble and such really makes you want to tell the people in this movie to go touch grass. Overall, it's very interesting and very well done, and I do think it is the part of the movie that stuck with me the most, as it was something that I think is genuinely applicable even today, especially today, as if you become entirely dependent on the system, how are you gonna get a job? How are you gonna solve problems that aren't directly wired into the system? How are you gonna live your best life? So for that, I genuinely say kudos to Megazone Part 3 and 4. Movies which, although in the cyber-esque genre, genuinely warn us about the dangers of cyber overdependence. Something which is ironic, but I find deeply touching. With that out of the way, I'd now like to take a brief moment to talk about the characters. I'm a character-driven guy, and perhaps their lack of real impact in this movie is why I wasn't necessarily too close to it. As we'll see, the characterizations in Megazone Part 3 and Megazone 23 Part 3 and 4 are some of its weakest aspects, and probably the reason I couldn't get myself too involved into it, as everyone here is Okay. Starting with some of the side characters and then moving up, we'll start with Ryu. Now, Ryu is Yuji's girlfriend and gets the plot kind of rolling by, going out on a date with him and introducing him to the idea that there are people whose data has been erased. He goes, why has their data been erased? Well, perhaps Orange did it. And this, of course, leads him further into his work with EX and fighting Orange, which leads him to realizing that Orange has a point, etc., etc. However, Ryu herself, for the person who gets the plot rolling, does shockingly little of anything in this movie. They do have a gratuitous nudity scene. I don't consider that a plus, but Ryu is featured in that for some reason. And she also gives this floppy disk to Scion so he can get the ball rolling on his own thing. But other than that, Ryu does very, very, very little. And doesn't really have a character other than generic woman who's relatively nice and doesn't really do that much. And yeah, that's Ryu. Moving to Scion, the rebel leader mentioned in the previous section, he's the guy with the cool sunglasses. And although at first he seems like an antagonist, we learn that he genuinely has a good moral compass and is looking simply to stop the people controlling EX from taking the rest of humanity down with them. Although his recontextualization as a good guy might seem a little unnatural, due to the nature of the plot and its flow, it actually feels pretty good. It makes sense that this guy would actually be the good guy and that we've been looking at things wrong. And the movie basically says, yeah, that's exactly what happened. And Scion becomes a good guy and teams up with Yuji. And I gotta give him credit for how well they pulled off the recontextualization of everything. He opens Yuji's eyes to the nature of everything. But again, past that, like Ryu, doesn't really do too much. While we're talking about not really characters, we should briefly touch on Wan Dai. Wan Dai is the leader of EX and the guy who claims to be that who speaks for the system, although we learn that he's actually an unwilling puppet of the system, one who's been lost to it after trying to control it for 1,000 years. Now I say 1,000 years because, hey, he might be Shogu! That's right. I don't know if the video I watched is translated incorrectly or not, because in that video they said he killed Shogu. However, on Wikipedia it says he is Shogu. Since I don't speak Japanese, I don't really know which one this is. However, I'm okay with either. If he killed Shogu, then that makes sense because he's a puppet of the system and he'd want to kill someone trying to fix the system. If he is Shogu, while I do think that is kind of character assassination, it still lends a tragic downfall element to this character we see for like 22 seconds. So, there is that attempt at adding gravitas to his humanity, which has been consumed so long ago. And either way, it also explains why he never woke Eve up in order to let the humans out of the city. As if he killed Shogu, well, Shogu can't go tell Eve. And if he's possessed by the system, well, he ain't getting out of the gamer chair to go tell Eve. However, since he has been possessed for 1,000 years and he only gets like 20 seconds of conversation where he's not possessed, this guy doesn't really have a character either, other than tragic man who was consumed by the thing he initially thought to use to better humanity. Again, it's fine, but this is not going to win any writing awards in my eyes. Now getting to actual characters, we have Jacob, the main operations guy of EX. Although Bishop Don Juan is the guy in charge of EX, Jacob is the main guy actually running everything. At first he seems cold and distant, but professional, although as the series progresses we can excavate this calm surface to see someone who is completely bought in to the inane ramblings of Don Y, as he blindly follows what the system has been ordering him to do, and he just trusts in the idea that, you know what, it's happening for a reason, I will be saved maybe, even if everyone else is not. Now it's important to note that Jacob is also very ruthless in pursuing these goals, as he puts following the system above everything else, and he's not above killing someone for his so-called morality. As such, he comes off as a bit of a hypocrite, and a bit of a psychopath at times. While this is a little one note, it is pretty entertaining at points, and he does pull off one of the most what the fuck kills I've ever seen in an anime, at least in a while, so he's gotta have some credit for that. His killing of his secretary was genuinely surprising and genuinely elicited something out of me, so good on you for that, Jacob. Although I will say that you don't get a pass because unlike Don Juan, you were not possessed by an evil computer, so have fun wherever you may be in the afterlife. I have a feeling it's not the best. And that gets us to Eve. Now, Eve is very interesting in this movie, as she's the only character who actually appears in all 4 Megazone 23 movies, unless Don Juan actually is Shogu, but, we're not going to count that. So, she has this very important role, both in a meta sense and on the actual movie. In the actual movie, I will say they did a very good job of maintaining the character of Eve. She's still benevolent, and she's still ultimately concerned with the fate of humanity and its overall protection. And I really like this, because while this isn't anything new, it does add a nice little charm to this series. It adds a little warmth to it that we don't really see throughout a lot of it due to the struggles with characterization and the overall bland feeling I got from a lot of it. I will say I genuinely liked a lot of the scenes with Eve because it was like, finally, something that I feel some kind of emotion towards. Something that I feel like I can relate to more. And it's ironic that as an AI, Eve actually has one of the more defined characters here, and even a tragic arc where she sacrifices herself in order to save humanity. Something which is, while a callback to the original movies, is still a noble character insight that we can draw inspiration from. I thought seeing her was great, and I like that while she does mention Shogu, that's not used as an excuse for filler flashback scenes. I thought there was going to be one, but it never happened, and I do respect that. In a meta sense, though, Eve also serves the important task of stitching these 2 movies together into the previous 2 movies. Since there is a character in all 4, we can see literal living continuity here, and it does help us fill in a few of the historical holes in our knowledge, so we know that yes, everyone knows about Megazone 23, and yes, they are the descendants of the original Megazone 23 cast. I like this continuity, and I like Eve's overall characterization, even if it is kind of a carryover from her original 2 appearances. Finally, that leads us to Yuji, I think I've been saying Yuji, but I might be pronouncing that wrong, who is the generic, fine, but nothing really notable protagonist. Like a lot of the other cast, this guy struggles with setting himself apart, and while a good protagonist, I do like how unflappable he is. I don't really see anything particularly noticeable about this guy. I do like his determination, and I do like how doggedly he tries to save people, and especially those he cares about. But if I said that a character is based on those 2 things, you could name a character from almost any anime. My point here is that he feels a little generic, which is fine. I'm not going to hold that against him. But there isn't really a super deep character arc or a super deep character. And the series is even kind of aware of that, as they straight up tell him, "You're no Shogu," and he quotes his memorable catchphrase, "I'm no Shogu, but I'll do." At least once. I don't think he literally says that, but he says something along those lines, letting us know that he's fine with the fact that he's not the original 7G operator, but the kind of replacement. And this does show some good humility on his side, but it also feels like a kind of meta admission of the fact that everyone here is aware that this is sort of a, I don't want to say cheap imitation, but definitely less memorable entry in the series than what preceded it. Which leads me to ask, are these 2 films memorable? Not more memorable than the original 2, because obviously they're not, but are they memorable at all? And I'm afraid to say, only sort of. There are a lot of great visuals in this film that could be picked apart for vaporwave stuff, as we have seen done with the first 2 movies. However, like every other issue with this, none of those scenes are going to be as iconic as the ones you could choose from the first 2 movies. There are a lot of cool ideas and concepts here, there are a lot of neat shots here, there are some unique character designs, and there are some genuinely stunning visuals and good songs in the soundtrack. However, this piece just lacks a lot of the atmosphere and heart that the original Megazone 23 had. I would be fine with it being a soft rehashing, or soft reboot of the original 2 movies. In fact, this one kind of is. And I would be fine if it was something completely different, or even if it was so bad that it was memorable. But Megazone 23 Part 3 and 4 don't have any of these. They just feel like weaker versions of what preceded them, and they are less than the sum of their parts, if I really had to say. Again, I didn't hate these movies. In fact, I did kind of enjoy them, I guess, but they just feel extremely flat compared to what preceded them, and I don't know how else to say that. But at least there is still heart in some of this, and there is still a lot of movement, and there is still some unique ideas and genuinely good theming. These 2 movies are not as memorable as what came before them, but they're not horrible either. They don't completely destroy Megazone 23 as a media property or story franchise. Not every swing is going to be a home run, But that doesn't mean that you can't get any kind of value out of a double or even a single. And if this movie is a hit, and I would say that it is to some extent, and then even if it's not a home run, at least you got on base. Yes, these are not the most memorable things, and they're nowhere near as memorable or even as good as what preceded them, but they're not a swing and a miss. They are just simply solid, if a little underwhelming, and obscure anime memories.